Katz. I head mobile innovation at Sanofi Pharmaceuticals. I am at BMKatz on Twitter. You want to talk to me, that's the best place to reach me. I am a compulsive...
Do you ever tweet, actually?
I'm a compulsive tweeter, as those of you who know me are in here. I also write, so I have a blog, and I also host the Mobilecast. We 10 episodes so far. We should hope. I'm off of vacation now, so vacation ended for me last week. Came straight here, so it should hopefully be some fun.
This is me. I'm Dan Shappir. I'm CTO at Ericom Software. We are an ISV. We create remote access software. Past couple of years, we've been focusing on HTML5, but we've also been doing, obviously, native clients as well. So even though I'll be presenting or emphasizing a certain aspect of the debate, I can also relate to the other side because at the end of the day, we are definitely doing both. I also tweet, not as compulsively as Brian does, but I'm getting there slowly but surely. I have a blog, not as good as Brian's for sure.
Thank you. That's
I'm
kind.
a 5-time Brian Ford speaker. This is actually my second session today. This is back-to-back, so this is going to be very interesting. I'm a developer, first and foremost. I'm not an IT person. I'm a software dev. That's what I am. That's what I do. That's what I've always done. That's it.
Okay, so let me explain where this came from, because this isn't on the slide. Dan did a session last year all about HTML5, similar to one he did earlier, and I disagreed with a couple of things that Dan said. And I brought it up during the session.
You heckled me.
A little. And Dan felt the need to corner me afterwards. And for the next 2.5 days of BriForum, Dan probably cornered me at every meal, every break, to continue this conversation. And what you don't know is in his last session, he admits that he's an engineer. He loves to argue. So no matter how much we argue, in the end, he actually likes it. So understand, that's where this came out of. That's where we kind of got the idea to do this. And we're going to go over a couple of definitions, and we can talk about those. But we did a couple questions ourselves. We'd like you guys to ask questions. Audience participation is important to us. And you want to know something, you want to come down on one side or the other, go for it. The whole thing here is participation. You guys in the back, you want to move up, plenty of empty seats.
Yeah, exactly. So you want to give me the thing?
Sure.
You can do it.
He's possessive of his clicker.
I'm possessive. No, it's not mine. It's the conference. I brought mine, then left it in the room this morning. But anyway, so the one thing we wanted to do, or I wanted to do before we actually start, is I wanted to define some of the terminology that we're going to use here, because I think it's very important in a technical discussion, and ultimately this is a technical discussion, to have the terminology straight. I mean, if you look at some of the sessions here, then we're using a lot of terms, and sometimes we don't actually define what we mean. We talked about, in Brian's session, we talked about files. What are files? Again, going to the definition. So a native application. A native application is literally what we mean when most people talk about applications. That's what they mean. When we install a Windows app, that's a native application. So a native application is a locally installed app that's specifically designed for the platform that it's running on. It uses SDKs or APIs provided by that platform. It might use a certain mandated programming language, but that's not necessarily the case. Now, you could say, in some cases, I have something like Fusion, and I can run Windows apps on top of the Mac, but that's really Windows itself running on the Mac, so it's still the Windows applications running on Windows. Any comment? Yeah?
Yeah, question for you. So where do you put a phone gap app? Is that a native app or not?
Hang on a sec. We're going to address those. So we just want to go through the definitions first.
Well, in this round, I'm going to be the one to heckle you.
No, that's fair. Hold on to that. It's actually a very good question, and I'll be very opinionated. So we'll see. There are a couple people in here who might want to pipe up.
One more thing, I have a head cold, so I'll be doing a lot of coughing and sneezing and wheezing throughout this.
To be clear, he just wants sympathy.
Yeah, I want the sympathy vote, for sure. Okay, web apps. Web apps are newer. They are newer in the sense that we've been doing web a long time, but the concept of the web app as opposed from just a regular website, that's a newer concept. And that's a concept of an actual web page that's behaving more like an application than just a source for, I don't know, reading news.
So let me take this for a second. If he gets native, I'm going to take a web app. A web app is essentially, it's HTML. Now, in this case, we're talking HTML5, a newer version of it. But it's HTML5 that's running on your phone. Sometimes it's referred to as responsive design. It's got a couple other pieces in there. And it can use some of the native stuff on the phone. It may be able to hook into. It usually can't hook into all of it. And but in the end, it's a web app. It's a web page.
I was gonna say, can we say that it's HTML5? It's not HTML5. It's HTML, JavaScript, and CSS working together to make an application.
Yes, that's
Yes.
that's a fair
HTML5 is
statement.
a spec.
Yes,
Yes.
HTML, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Although to our detriment, people use it these days.
I know. As
To
as
cover
if it's
all
a
that.
language or something, but
Yeah.
no.
You know, part of the fact is that they've actually promoted it as a brand.
Right.
So, you know, I said HTML5 is the first version that has a logo, you know.
But a web app to me is an application
Yeah.
coded in HTML, JavaScript,
Yeah,
and CSS.
exactly.
We can all agree on that.
And that web app exists somewhere else.
Yes.
It's on a web server somewhere.
Yes, but it runs on the local device. In most modern web apps, you know, they can definitely still have code or logic that happens somewhere else in some ASP page on some web server. But when people talk about modern web apps, they usually are talking about JavaScript code executing on the endpoint device itself.
Right.
But that's delivered from something else.
Yes, it is delivered, although again, it could,
It's initially delivered.
it initially delivered. But
The
you,
state of the application is exchanged usually via REST or something
So-
else.
so
It
it-
does
it can-
full
the-
messaging. You're not delivering larger portions of the app on each request.
The-
Too many engineers, because if we keep going, I can start
So the app
building
is
a file
essentially,
server,
let's boil this down and make it simpler.
Here is not to get them off this slide.
It's essentially cached on the device, and then it goes and checks and makes sure that it has all the data that it needs.
exactly.
And then we're going to
And
hit hybrid,
finally,
and we're going to
hybrid.
disagree on this. So I'm going to let him go first.
Okay, a hybrid app from my perspective is essentially a native app that's using a web component to create its user interface. So effectively, you know, in technical terms, it's a browser hosted within the application, and also APIs are exposed from inside the application to the browser. So JavaScript or web code running in that browser has access to additional services beyond those provided by the generic browser on that platform because it has access to those APIs. But really from a significant perspective, this is really a form of native app because from the end user's perspective, it's installed from the App Store. It's launched like any other native app. You don't go into the browser to get at that application. So you could almost say that the fact that it uses the browser is a technical aspect that the user doesn't care about, doesn't know about, may not know about.
So I'm going to agree with a lot of that. I've usually said that when we talk about a hybrid app, and I've changed my mind a little bit in the last few months, but what we're really talking about is using web app as a presentation layer and then using native to actually pull those pieces on the phone. I've actually heard somebody define it the exact opposite, which was an interesting way to look at it. And I'm not going to go into that complete definition, but there are a bunch of different ways to do this. What's important about a hybrid app, though, is you can make certain changes to the app, and you don't have to go through the App Store. You can use that web app part of it to make those changes on the fly. You don't have to necessarily get them approved. It does make it interesting and an easier way to do things.
So long as they don't reach outside the container.
Yeah, one interesting thing, though, is that in the future, not yet on mobile devices, but on other platforms, we will see other forms of hybrid apps. And some of them, at least, will make their way to phones as well. So, for example, there are the Chrome apps that can be installed through the Chrome Web Store. Currently, they're supported on every platform where Chrome runs except mobile phones. But essentially what it means is it's a web app packaged together inside of a container. It's essentially a zip with a manifest file, JSON, that specifies certain requirements that the app has, like accessing the file system or clipboard or whatever, and then it gets installed as an icon on that device. So in effect, it's a way to create a hybrid app, but without using some third-party component. It actually uses stuff that's installed by the browser itself on the device. Another example, which I'll mention very briefly, is something called NACL or PNACL, which is another Google technology, which is like plugins done right, although that's debatable. I don't know if plugins can be done right, but sorry?
ActiveX done right?
There's
ActiveX
no
done
such
right.
thing.
That's clearly done wrong.
There's no such thing.
Wouldn't Metro be another example of a hybrid app?
Sorry, which?
Metro applications or whatever Kyle
Yeah, you can
Yes.
actually create Metro app or whatever they call them that these days using HTML5,
Modern
JavaScript.
UI.
Modern UI, that's wonderful. No Windows, you take away features and somehow it's more modern. But anyway, so you can do that. I guess the only reason they really did it is they're looking for developers to create more applications for the Windows 8 new Metro stuff.
Well, and RT cross-platform compatibility.
Well, let's take a minute here to talk about Windows Phone 8, and then we'll leave it in the heap on the side. And I'm going to, we can come back to it if you want, but let's be fair here. Windows RT doesn't run your regular apps. It runs the apps they create. The apps that run on Metro on Windows RT are actually different and have to be recompiled to run on Windows 8 Pro or Windows 8 versus RT. It really is a whole nother beast. And I'll throw my opinion in here. I think that the mistake that Microsoft made was that they didn't take Windows Phone and move it to a tablet. I don't think they need RT. I think Windows Phone is much more suitable, much more ready. And when you look at the new 8-inch tablets that come out there, I think you're wasting your time if you're not on Windows Phone 8. And I'll leave it at that. So what we did is we formulated 3 questions for us. So I want to move on and actually get to the debate part, the fun part.
Before we do that, though, again, about this debate. So this is a debate for geeks, or nerds, or whatever term is used these days. And we don't want you to be like Leonard, standing there in the background looking, pained. We want you to participate in this discussion, which you're already doing, which is great. So without further ado.
I'll let you decide which one of us is which in that one. But we came up with 3 questions, and then we're leaving it open-ended.
I'm the foreigner,
So, and we're both Jewish, so that's another part. I don't know who fits as who. We're going to have fun here. You got to laugh and have fun, and you have to be able to make fun of yourself. So, are mobile apps intrinsically different than legacy desktop apps? That's an easy one. Yes. If you develop things using legacy thinking, they're crapplications. And they're going to continue to be crapplications. Because the way legacy apps were built is people sat down, they started coding an app, and someone said, well, can you add this feature? Can you add that feature? How many people here use Word? Or have used Word? Because I'm sure some of you use Google. How many people know how many functions are in Word? Anybody? Guess? Not 35,000. Close to 1,000. I've heard people say 400. I've heard people say 1,000. I've heard people say 4,000. How many people here, and this is a serious question, use more than 40 commands in Microsoft Office? 2. Well, okay, so keep your hands up for a second. How many people use more than 30 commands in Microsoft Office? Put your hand up. Still at 2. 20? Okay, now we're getting there. And part of the point of developing a mobile app is to focus on your user needs and understand what they actually do. Spend time with your users. Forget whether or not we're talking HTML5 native or hybrid for a second. A mobile app is different from a legacy app just for the fact that you're focusing on the user need. Your goal is to create an app that they use. Let's go to Steve Jobs, something that delights them. You don't want a crap application. Because you know what happens when you have a crap application? They go and they find an app that does it better themselves. And it may not be secure, you may not know where your data is, you have no idea what's going on. Develop apps based upon what your user needs are.
I do want to argue a little bit with one point, and that's after all the point of the discussion. The reason I wasn't raising my hands when you were asking about the features is that first of all, I use Google. I use Google for this, but the thing really is that I have no idea how many Office features I actually use. I never try to count them, so I really don't know, and that goes to one of the main problems with leaving features out. is that, you know, you may use only 30 features and he may use only 30 features, but they may not be the same 30 features.
Sure, but what I would say to you there is you want to hit 80% of your target audience. And if you know, part of that is spending time with your user. And if you don't spend time with your users and see what they actually do, you can't build apps for them. It's that simple. You may miss a feature. It doesn't mean somebody can't go to the desktop. It doesn't mean somebody can't use a legacy app. But for most of them, you want to actually hit where they're going.
Well, I mean, I don't know that it's fair to categorize all legacy apps in that way. You're talking about Word, which is something to the extent of, in a political thing, like a congressman getting elected versus like a mayor. You know, you have stuff like Snagit. It's a very small app, right? Very small.
Sure, but
It works with their users. Great at what it does.
but here's what Snagit did. If you think about it, Snagit actually said, I'm going to build an app. And if you remember the original Snagit, it only had 6 commands in it because it went out and said, essentially, for those of you who know Instapaper and Marco Arment, and you like him, hate him, I don't care. What you'll know about him, though, is he builds apps for himself because it's pieces that he needs. And what the original Snagit people did is they went out and they built an app based upon what they actually did. So yeah, I do agree that not all legacy apps are that way. But the apps that aren't that way are actually very easy to move over, or there are already replacements for them. You know, when we're talking legacy, you know, we're enterprise people here. I'm assuming most of us, if not all of us, are. We're talking everything from Office, your ERP system. How many people have an SAP system? If you've ever done anything in there, we do expenses in there among other things. It is an absolute nightmare. So, but I do get your point. It's true. It is not every app, but the apps that actually looked at what the user does, they're already following this user-centric design. So I'd say that when they focus on that, it is not every legacy app. That's a fair point.
I would also add, before you continue, I would also add that the fact that we have such small real estate within that screen forces us really to concentrate on the essentials. I mean, you know, for years, monitors have been growing, and developers were used to the fact that every year we get higher resolution, bigger monitors, 2 monitors, 3 monitors. All of a sudden, we went to the complete other end of the spectrum where we have this small real estate thing. So you really need to concentrate on what functionality you're actually putting there. And if you try to create a single app that can literally do, you know, everything and wash the dishes, then you're not going to be able to fit that user interface effectively into a phone.
So I think Steve was going to make the point.
Just to be clear.
Ouch.
I agree with you.
Jeez.
Well, Leonard's cool. I mean, he's got Penny.
I'll take Leonard.
And my son will like the fact that I'm Sheldon. So.
So everyone's happy. I understand what you're saying. I don't think it's quite right. I think it's closer to what Sheldon is saying, which is that it's not that the app developers are so smart and they got to the essential feature. It's a limited platform. Mostly single tasking. And an enterprise app does do
With a fundamentally different interface
right.
that limits how you can interact
But-
with it.
Like
but-
a nice accident.
see,
like,
I'll-
just by focusing on like the 1 or 2 things I want to do, I could sell it for 99 cents.
Right.
And
But
just
what
like
I'll
that.
tell you, Steve, is
One more comment.
Sure.
The enterprise apps are doing what the user needs. They're just putting it into a single, more comprehensive interface. Right? I mean, there's still, they're not coming with
we can actually debate that if you'd like, but let me hit the first point.
Okay.
You look at the apps that first came out for the iPhone. I don't know. Anybody here download the first Fart app? Some of the other wonderful ones out there?
Lighter.
Crappy interfaces. Absolutely crappy interfaces unless they only did one thing. Later, you started the app, it came on, it did nothing else. Once you got past that, I mean, I do a presentation normally where I pull up 5, 6, 7 apps where you have no idea what the interface does. People are still doing this today. And it's not even a question of scope creep, because scope creep is the issue that we're talking about before. This is an issue of people still don't talk to their users. They don't test it. There's UX. There's everything else involved. You know, there's a large piece to that. So, you know, but as a whole, when you look at enterprise apps, there are features in there that only one person in your company will use. Now, that feature may be the most important thing to that one person, but why am I exposing it to the other 99% if they don't need it? It really doesn't, you know, and I'll tell you, SAP's actually learned their lesson. SAP is putting out mobile apps. And, you know, I've talked to SAP, and they've actually said, yeah, we actually like our mobile apps. We need to do this on the desktop. They're not there on the desktop. You know, and that's part of where mobile first comes in, because mobile first is not mobile only. But, you know, it's one of those things that mobile first just means you consider what the user needs are, and then you expand out based upon the platform. Okay, so when you get to the desktop, it's okay to add more features to it. You have that ability. There's no reason not to do it, but you still want to be careful that you don't make it so complicated that people can't figure out what they're doing.
I also want to add that, you know, the mobile platform takes away in the sense that the screen is smaller or you don't have a keyboard and a mouse, but it also gives, because we have a lot of stuff in the mobile platform that we don't have in the desktop platform. First of all, the fact that it's so accessible. In the past, even if I had a laptop, I had to, you know, stop, take out the laptop, open the lid and so forth. The phone would just pull it out. So that's number one. Number two, I have all these additional services that historically did not exist in the desktop platform. A camera, the ability to record, a GPS, all this stuff that you can now use and leverage. And the key thing to remember is that many of the developers that are developing these applications aren't yet up to speed on these things. So you really need to think about the stuff that you need and what it is, because don't expect the developer necessarily to give it to you, because they won't necessarily know or think about it.
So let's go to question 2. What's the best way to mobilize a legacy app?
I'll start with this. Well, I work at a company that provides remote access solutions. So obviously I do think, and I know that that's one of the biggest arguments, is that remote access is a legitimate solution. First of all, in some cases, you literally don't have a choice. I mean, if you have an organization that has thousands of applications, I mean, or let's put it another way. I totally agree that ideally we would like to get to a world where all the applications that users use are applications that were created specifically for the platform that they use, be they web, be they native. And I think that you certainly want the applications that the users primarily use to be such applications. But the fact of the matter is that many organizations have thousands, have hundreds or thousands of applications, and they cannot get there, certainly not overnight. And you can't, you know, like stop mobility until you actually get there, because if you try to do that, you will just fail. And also, let's be honest, with some applications, it's just not cost effective to try to mobilize them, because it's some in-house, homegrown application that you don't have the source code for anymore, or you have the source code but it's not commented, nobody spec'd out the business logic, stuff like that. The vendor that created it is out of business. So yeah, you could redo that application, but if it's an application that's really used by a few users and it's usable enough, I do think that remote access is a legitimate solution, especially with some of the technologies that we're seeing coming out, like AppShift from VMware, that make it a more friendly experience to use such applications remotely.
So let me be clear here, and I'm going to commit some heresy being that I'm at BriForum. I got VMware, Citrix, some others in the room. VDI sucks. And why is VDI, and we can call it server-based computing, call it whatever we want. But taking VDI, putting it on this, and yeah, we can do some really nice things. We can make it so that we can swipe. VMware's come out with some stuff. Citrix has some stuff. They all have kits that allow you to do this. FrameHawk does a great job as well. We can go out there. We can probably find 4 other vendors that do it. But in the end, you know, if you've ever seen the FrameHawk demo, they actually have an Outlook screen that pops up on here. It's your actual Outlook screen. I don't care what you say. It still looks like crap. Now, let's be clear. If I need to do a 5-minute thing on this device, that's fine for me. Because if it means that all I have to do is spend 5 minutes in a legacy app, VDI, server-based, app streaming, whatever we want to do, is a valid way to do it. But if I'm actually going to expect my users to do that on this device, on the phone, whatever else, I got to give them a better solution. I really do, because what I found is that if we're going to do that, we have to show them a plan of how we're going to mobilize that app. And yes, there's some apps that really can't be mobilized. There are a few of them. But the truth of the matter is if you've had that app and, you know, I won't tell you, well, I will tell you this. We still have at least one NT4 server running in our company. I can tell you that when we did the data center decommissioning a couple years ago for some of our data centers, we found some old digital servers that were more than 20 years old that were still running. Yes, there's stuff out there. But I would argue with you that if you have a ton of people using them, you probably should get off them anyway. It doesn't mean that you have to get off everything at once, but you have to look at solutions. Sometimes it's, how can I maybe make a new front end, create an API that can feed this data in through screen scraping and everything else to actually give a good experience to my users? How do I look at it and how do I split those pieces up? I mean, what I'll tell you.
Have you seen a successful screen scraping application for a Windows application?
Actually, I have. It worked actually. It worked
Screen
better than the
scraping-
one that was shown this morning.
Screen
I'll put it that way.
screen
Well, no.
scraping
When
was
I say screen scraping, what I mean is it looks like it's a real app on the device, but there's an API that takes that data and actually puts those keys and actually acts like a human.
I understand what you mean by screen
So-
scraping. What I'm saying is that screen scraping was bad on legacy, and it's even worse with Windows. I've yet to see a successful implementation.
But sometimes if you're going to make a user use it all the time, you got to find something better.
There's
Because
a difference between a screen scrape and an API that enables a mobile interface.
well, and
No, but if you do-
I'm mixing my terms, but so that's fair. So in reality, what I mean is it's some sort of app on the device that's been mobilized, a true mobile app, whether forget which format it's in, that you use an API to take that data and actually push the characters into the Windows program. I've seen that done, and I've actually seen that done well.
I'm grimacing for those who don't see.
Well, you just made a point. So app, in this case, or what both of you are talking about, assuming that there's API or even data backend, the app doesn't matter. What you're trying to get at is the data. And for your SAP example, if you just care about the data, you can create a small enough app that gives you what you need with that feature set. So don't even worry about mobilizing a legacy.
But when do you ever care just about the data and not about the business logic? I mean, if it's just the data.
But hang on. Let me fix Jason's comment because I know exactly where he's going. Really, all we do care about is the data, but data means nothing until it's turned into information and knowledge. And that's where business logic and everything else fits in. So yes, there has to be a way to put it in to the legacy app. So SAP's created these modules. They still have the regular old gigantic monolithic SAP backend. That hasn't changed. It hasn't. Ask them. They still make you pay the money for it, install it, put all the databases in, do all this work, but they have a mobile app that handles some of those pieces. And when you start looking at it and breaking down what you need to do based upon what your users are doing, it becomes much easier. For us, we're going to a new expense app. We're going to a brand new front end. Why? Because if you tried mobilizing our SAP piece, it's a nightmare. It's a nightmare on the desktop. Nobody likes to do expenses, and they take way too long.
I would like to add one more point here. There is a distinction, in my opinion, first of all, between when you're mobilizing something to a phone versus to a tablet. If you know that you're mobilizing just to tablets, then a VDI-TS type approach is more reasonable. I totally agree that you don't want to use a Windows application on a phone unless it's an emergency. And the second thing is that going forward, and that goes back to Brian's and Gabe's presentation, at the end of the day, we're going to be publishing apps much more than Windows desktops going forward, in my opinion, in those cases as well. So if you can get in and out of the app without having to go through the start menu experience, then again, it's a more reasonable thing. But that concludes my opinions on that point.
So let's get to the last one.
Okay, you start.
No.
Oh.
Real simple.
Okay.
And what I'll say, I'll expand just a little. The place where enterprise mobile apps are different from consumer apps for the moment. You're trying to put security and context around that stuff. That's where the difference is. That's where the table stakes are. You look at where Evernote was. Evernote started in the consumer world. What have they done in the last year? They've added security. They've added enterprise controls around it. They've added, you can put a pin in there. You can put protection in. I think you're going to start seeing a lot more consumer apps do that. But from the perspective of how you build an app and how you design it and what you give to people, your UX has to be just as good as a consumer app, because if it's that much more difficult, There are 800,000 apps in both app stores right now for both Android and for iOS. More, but this is a month and a half ago's numbers. People are going to go out and find another solution, and they're going to go around you. So are some of them different right now? Yes, because you have people who, one of the problems that you have is that you have developers who who were desktop developers and made them mobile developers. If you don't help them and spend time with them, explain to them that UX matters, UI matters, yeah, there are going to be differences. Should there be differences? No.
I would argue, sure, the apps are intrinsically different. However, the development process and constraints are what make it different, right? And
I totally agree.
Enterprise developer dreams of building something as great
Sure.
as the top consumer level interface.
100%. Yeah, when you look in enterprise, there are constraints. You have project management. You have all this other stuff you have to do. You have to go around that. But we're not really talking about what the constraints are we put around the developer. What we're talking about is when we design the app, should they be different? No. And my answer would be no.
I think Dan brought up earlier, though, the business logic is the difference between a consumer and mobile app.
So let me ask a question to you. Evernote, consumer app, right? Does it have business logic? Yeah, I would say it absolutely does. What we call business logic depends on the app and what it does.
Sure, but I'm thinking more like, SAP, accounting, expense. There have to be operations that relate to the
So let's take Expensify. Expensify was a consumer app first. Track your expenses, then became, hey, we can hook it into these expense systems. Let's get more and more expense systems online and build back-end business logic, not in the front end. We left it alone.
Stop putting it on the client.
So,
but the point is, it becomes enterprise because they've done that, right? Because
sure.
they're addressing business logic and
I think business logic's the wrong term. I think the fact, because it hooks into the enterprise, it becomes an enterprise app. I don't want to say business logic, because business logic implies what the app itself does.
Okay.
And it's got logic, no matter how, data logic, knowledge logic, however you want to look at it. It does what it does. It's the piece after that. And I do agree with you. Sure, what makes an enterprise app is you use it as part of your enterprise day-to-day stuff. It helps you with the process.
I do want to say, though, that there are a couple of development differences, let's call them, between enterprise apps and consumer apps, which ultimately affect or impact how these apps are constructed in the outcome. And we can look at the, let's call it the dark sides of enterprise app development, but also at the good sides of enterprise app development. Because when you're developing a consumer application, you can't really get at your entire target audience. You can, if you're good, you can get at a certain subset and engage. Many cases, consumer apps are just written by this guy in a basement based on what he likes. When you're creating an enterprise app, you actually have access to your target audience, and you can engage them during the planning stages, during the development stages. And obviously, this could lead to bad things like feature creep and gold plating and whatever. But if you do it effectively, and if you're familiar with development processes like Agile, and when you engage your audience and do it iteratively, and add the features and then give it and continuously go back and forth, then it means that you can actually create enterprise apps more easily that are really engaging and effective to your target audience, and I think that's very important.
So let me say that a little bit differently. In the enterprise, if you do it well, you can talk to your users. The truth of the matter is most enterprise developers don't talk to their users. The business won't let them. It's sad. It's horrible, but it is what happens. But and you're right, it should happen on the consumer side. What usually happens on the consumer side is you release the app, then you get all the feedback, and it's version 2 where you have all these users, and you've learned to engage. The problem on the enterprise, and where the enterprise still hasn't figured it out yet, is you don't get a version 2. Because a lot of the time, you build an app, and it's a crap application, they go right to the app store. We have people who use Expensify, some of the other things out there, to take pictures of their receipts, do their piece, print it all up, and then try and feed into the system or give it to somebody else to feed in the system. So we do see that. But I do agree that you have the capability. Whether you use it and can use it's another story. I know, Scott, you had a question.
I'm going to make some comments on this. So, number one, we have 30 years experience of building enterprise apps, of trying to talk to users and building good apps. It doesn't work, okay? Enterprise apps are designed poorly. We also only fund them once, so you get one shot at it, okay? That was where I thought you were going to go, Brian. So you don't
I'll agree with both those points.
Yeah.
That you need to change enterprise development. And when I get in front of audiences, I talk about that. Number one, the project never ends.
Yep.
The truth of the matter is, you're making 6-week or 12-week sprints. You're always updating your app. But that's true of consumers too. But the answer is, you need to do that. That's a change.
Consumer apps either disappear or you iterate until you get 4 or 5 stars in the App Store.
A fair state. And you'll see some of that happen with iOS 7.
Yep.
Picking on them for a second. People who don't iterate and change their apps for iOS 7 are going to see people move to other apps because maybe they're not as responsive, maybe they don't fix a bug that the new APIs introduce. And so but your first point, you're absolutely right. We don't build enterprise apps right because in the past, everybody told you what to put in it. You show me an enterprise app, and Snagit's not an enterprise app, but show me an enterprise app that doesn't have scope creep in it. And show me an enterprise app, and if you're a developer in here, where you didn't start developing the app, get 50% down the road, showed it to the business or project manager, and they say, hey, you know what? This would be really cool. They may be the only one who ever uses that feature, but this would be really cool. Could you put this feature in there? And it only adds an hour or 2 hours or maybe a week, depending on how long you have to, and you put it in there. All of a sudden, you have this app with all this stuff in it. We don't talk to the users. We never have. When you sit there and one of the ways I advocate building apps is spend a day with your user or multiple users. Have your developers go out. I always recommend our developers do ride-alongs to actually see what our users do when they get, I'm a pharmaceutical. We have salespeople who get in front of doctors. We have people who use it in the clinic. See how they do it day to day. Then figure out, can I create an app that gives them the pieces that they need? And by the way, going that 80-20 rule, they may do some work that they want to get done right there and do that other 20% when they get home to their desk, where they may be on a PC.
This isn't part of the problem if you can't fix stupid, because, no, I mean seriously,
no, that's a fair statement.
Any good development team would naturally do that. I'm an integrator consultant. One of the reasons we're so successful is that I will personally go out and learn the workflow of the end user.
Yeah, but bad habit,
but bad large enterprise, the line of business guys, that threatens their job. They have to be the experts. Therefore, they intentionally isolate
It's
the stupid developers. I know what's best for this business. You'll do.
It's the partnership piece of you need to explain to the line of business and get them to agree that the users are part of the partnership.
The difference here is that, I actually think the consumer mobile apps are going to drive the enterprise, not the other way around.
Oh, I agree.
The reason is because on the consumer side, you release the app, you have a feedback mechanism, and if you don't respond, you go away. There's now consumer choice. Enterprise apps, historically, there is no choice. There's one person building the app, you use it or you don't do your job, So that feedback loop on the consumer side results in the best of breed interfaces for functions rising to the top. And that's then what enterprise users expect out of their experience.
And I agree, and there's another benefit is that if we look at the mobile platforms, you have very effective mechanism for updating the applications now. Yeah. In the past, you would deploy an enterprise app, you'd be stuck with it for years until you could update it. Now it becomes, at least the client side of it, becomes much easier. In fact, for enterprise, it's sometimes easier to upgrade because in the consumer space, with the Apple, for example, or with iOS applications, it's very difficult to upgrade your client and not upgrade the server, and if you're creating some sort of impedance mismatch in the communication protocol. With the enterprise, it's easier to coordinate those things. So in fact, in some ways, we are getting a lot of value from the consumer space now back into the enterprise space. I think we need to move on, though.
Let's go to the next slide.
Okay, so I'll start, you start? Who goes first?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, okay. So can HTML5...
This is your wheelhouse, go for it.
So can HTML5 apps be good enough? The answer is yes, depending on your needs. So from my perspective, and that's what got us in that previous argument the first time, was that I had a slide in my presentation that said that HTML5 should be the default. I never said it should be the only choice. I said it should be the default choice.
Can you see why we argued? Right there?
Well, but I think you're saying you start there, and if you need to go
Exactly. You basically need to look at the feature set that you need. There are obviously requirements or features that currently cannot be served by HTML5 apps. Some of them may never be served by HTML5 apps. Some of them may be served in a couple of years. Yes?
To the other gentleman's point earlier, when you're saying HTML5, are you presuming that you are always online, or will this work offline?
No, I'm not assuming always online. Okay. Or let's put it this way. Working offline is a requirement that you may or may not have within your application. And if you have a requirement to work offline, then HTML5 web app may or may not meet your needs.
Okay, and that's what I'm getting at, because when we were making the comment earlier, was HTML being external and you getting the information from somewhere, or when we're talking about HTML versus native, are we talking about online versus offline processing also?
So,
yes.
Let me pop in there. Yes, we are talking about that, but again, really what we're saying here is, from his perspective, and I'll agree with it, HTML5 and web apps now have the capability to do offline caching and allow you to do some work. Where I'm going to disagree, and we're going to kind of jump off the script, start jumping off the script now, is can HTML5 apps be, or web apps be good enough? Sure they can. But the question today isn't good enough. And if that's what you're focused on, you already have an issue. Okay? You know, good enough may work for a short time. Good enough doesn't work for a long period. Okay? And that doesn't mean that they're not right, and it's the requirements that you look at. The thing I said to Dan, he argued with me, and I said to him straight off, and I'll say it to everybody right here, I don't care what you build your app in. I don't care whether you build a native, hybrid, or HTML5. You build it based upon your requirements for the app. If your app is going to be, if your device is going to be always online, if your device doesn't need to access the camera, doesn't need to do some of the other features, make it a web app. You have web developers, it's easy to do. If on the other hand, you need to do things like, I want to access the camera and not wait 5 seconds. I want to be able to do constant GPS. I need to be able to go through a tunnel. I need to be able to handle the accelerometer and other stuff. And HTML5 can do a lot of that. It doesn't do it very well. So you're going to take some trade-offs on responsiveness. And when you start looking at it that way, that doesn't mean HTML5 apps can't be good enough. But again, and Dan said it himself, it's based upon the requirements. So where we're going to disagree is, you don't start at HTML5. Screw that. You look at your requirements, you talk to your users, and you figure out what the heck you're building. If I know that I need a camera, a GPS, accelerometer, I'm going to be offline, chances are I'm not going to look at HTML5 first. Not even going to look at it. If I'm doing look, there are two major reasons people have built web apps up till now, until probably 6 to 9 months ago. Reason number one, I want to avoid the financial burden of going through the Apple App Store and eventually the Google Play Store. Okay, Apple takes 30%. Financial Times looked at it and said, screw it. I'm not paying them 30%. I want to get my customer data. I'm going to do it this way. And they built a web app, and it's good enough. It does a good job. But their requirement was, I can't go through the Apple Store. So it made sense for what they did. Okay? There's a second reason to it, which I think is a misnomer here, because we'll get to the phone gap stuff soon. People think that HTML5 web apps give you the ability to do cross-platform easily and give a great experience. And what I'll tell you is, Who's got an iPhone 5 here? Who's got a Samsung Galaxy phone? Anybody? Which one?
Note 2.
Note 2. What do you have?
Note 1.
Okay. Do you know that your two phones can't do HTML5 apps the same way? There's actually a slight difference between your devices. Yep. There's a slight difference between your device and his device and how they handle HTML5. And Dan said in his earlier presentation, Apple's actually done a very good job as far as hitting standards. But then we also have these pieces that aren't really standards yet. WebRTC came up in the last one. People are trying to do that. There are other pieces that aren't standards that people are trying to shove in. You know, we have the new 5.1 standard, the 5.2 standard. They're all good pieces, but it means I now have to care about what device I'm on. And if I'm looking at things like that, I have to be careful that I don't limit myself. That doesn't mean that if I have something that doesn't need those features, or I'm only targeting one device, HTML5 may still be the best way to go.
Yeah, but in reality, how often do we actually, in the enterprise apps, even in consumer apps, how often do we actually live on the bleeding edge? I mean, if I look at most enterprise apps, and I'm not necessarily talking about apps that a Microsoft or a VMware or Citrix builds for installing in the enterprise. I'm also talking about applications that enterprises sometimes build themselves or even in SAP. You know, most applications are essentially data entry. And if you're looking at it from that perspective, I mean, we're so far away from the bleeding edge. Now, I totally agree. If you're trying to fully replicate a native experience within a web app, you're doing it wrong. It just doesn't make sense, especially if you try to replicate an iOS look and feel on an iOS device and then an Android look and feel on an Android device. You've lost before you've even started. But if you're saying I'm going to develop something that looks like a web app, but is highly usable on a mobile device, and it's a data entry application, I mean, it makes perfect sense from my perspective. Why do it twice?
And if you target WebKit, which is essentially the rendering engine for almost every browser, whether it's desktop or mobile.
At least for now.
And iOS, sure.
At least for now.
Yeah, but I mean, it's, right, you can say that about anything, the iOS and Android, for now. Who knows what it's going to be.
Developers
Right?
have dealt with this
Forever.
though.
Yeah.
This
Yep.
use case of every browser is different. So I mean, that's nothing.
But if you're
new to
doing, and
them.
I agree, that most enterprise apps, it's forms.
If you're,
Forms.
so
Yeah,
let,
that's
let,
going to be supported across the board.
so let's show some agreement here.
Yeah.
If you're doing simple forms and I'll go back to it. You're
Yeah.
doing simple stuff, you don't run into those problems. And if you're doing simple stuff and you just want it to be a web page that shows up across your devices, HTML5 is just fine. It really
I
is.
think the reality is that's most apps, especially enterprise apps. That's what they're doing.
I-
Enterprise
but-
apps
but-
aren't
but
getting
here's where-
GPS and the camera.
But I'll
But
tell
actually,
you
if they
something.
want GPS, they can, and that's another key aspect.
Sure.
But
But
I'll tell you, I'm a pharmaceutical. I have a bunch of apps, internal apps that we've developed that use the GPS. I have apps we use to take pictures. I have apps that we use the accelerometer for. I have simple stuff that does a presentation. Okay, now I probably want native there as well, but I have simple stuff, and I can do a web piece.
It's interesting, in that case, do you write it native for more than one platform, or do you target iOS or Android, or how do you do that?
So let's talk a little bit about Sanofi for a second. Like most enterprises out there, we are a mostly iOS shop. And we're mostly an iOS shop for two reasons. The security controls are in the devices. So we have basic security controls. I don't have to worry about Android fragmentation. I don't have to worry about some of those other pieces. And they're enterprise ready. In reality, I have encryption. I can put certificates on the device. I can do VPNs. I can do all these pieces that work really well that I have to cobble together depending upon who my OEM is if I'm on Android. I can't use Windows Phone yet, and I can't use Windows Phone because there aren't the enterprise security controls aren't there. They'll be there first half of next year. Microsoft announced it. I'm looking forward to that. I do like a lot of things about Windows Phone. I can use BlackBerry once I get my new BlackBerry Fusion servers up there. I just don't have any demand for it. Yeah, that's
No
not
demand?
completely true. I have some demand for it, but if you look at where the demand is, demand's where it traditionally was. So, for example, you look at Asia Pac, and I'm generalizing now because it's not just us. You look at Asia Pac is huge on BlackBerries because they're cheap. The phones are cheap. Not Asia Pac's cheap, but the phones are cheap, and the phones are cheap, and there's a certain they're of course we're driven by budget and everything else, and it makes sense for them. But again, I think BlackBerry's still going through growing pains. 10.1 got released officially this morning, and there are issues with it magically deleting some text messages and some other things. If you're a user, do you want a phone that does that, especially if you live in a place where all you do is text?
Let me ask you though, hypothetically, just outside of this, if there was
Sure.
a framework that could run universally, you would be in favor of it. You're just saying that this.
I would be in favor. I'm always in favor of frameworks. I believe, here's my simple philosophy on developing apps, because it's not about apps, it's about content and knowledge. So the first thing you have to do is you have to free your data. And this is a hard concept for almost every single enterprise. You need to write APIs that free your data up and expose them to apps. So you build apps that hit those APIs that allow people to use that data. Now, those APIs are secured, so we look at identity and access management, we have security built around them, but then we build apps to them.
I want to add to that, if I can interrupt for a second.
Give 2 seconds. I don't care what kind of app. I'm not saying, right now I'm just going specifically, if you ask me, that's how I would do it.
I totally agree. I think there's absolutely no justification in not building APIs to your data these days. I mean, the tools for doing it are so easy to use. They're effectively free. Yeah, there are a lot of companies doing it and getting bought and whatnot, but at the end of the day, I could just put a web server on top of a database, and that's more or less it if I want to create an API, using XML or JSON or whatever. Authentication is also essentially a solved problem. So there's absolutely no reason not to put APIs in front of your data, for sure. The question again is, how do I build the interface in front of the user and try to avoid replicating work? How do I get or extract the logic that manipulates the data and put it in front of the user where the user can access it? But again, going back to some of your points with the mobile devices, I do want to ask a question about, okay, so Sanofi is obviously a big organization, but if we're talking about small organizations, if we're talking native, how are we going to push these applications out? If it's a homegrown native application, how are we going to push it out to all the users?
Enterprise, an app store. App stores are a dime a dozen these days.
Still,
I can go to my carrier, and my carrier will actually bill me a per user monthly thing and give me an app store. They'll give me MDM, they'll give me MAM. They partnered with everybody from the top 2, AirWatch and Mobile Iron, to people like Aperion and other stuff that allow me to actually create app stores, put my stuff out there easily, and make it available.
How do you have a unified app store experience for mobile apps, legacy apps, virtual apps? What's your philosophy on that? Like if your users have to sit there and they say, well, I'm getting a mobile app, I have to go here, I'm getting a desktop app, and I have to go here. I mean, I just covered schools of thought.
Okay, so we don't do it well on the desktop. To be fair, we do not do it, we don't do it well. A lot of enterprises have problems with it. On mobile devices, it's a piece of cake because they're already doing it. So for them to pick up their mobile device and see the thing that says Sanofi App Store on it, boom, they're done. They just click it, they go in, they see the recommended public apps, they see the apps that are required, they see the app, we can actually push apps down to them if we want. They're completely used to that. From that perspective on a mobile device, there's no training involved unless I'm with somebody who had a feature phone, and it's very few of my people.
How do you match the app against what the device? Because if somebody brings their own device, and obviously you're standardized on iPhones, but if somebody brings their own device into the
So I approach my recommendation on BYOD, and this is not a Sanofi recommendation, this is a Brian Katz recommendation, I've written about it, is there's no such thing as BYOD if you're going to do it right. It's called managed BYOD. And what I mean by that is you provide access to your ecosystem based upon the device capabilities that you allow. And what's magical about it is when you publish a list that says if you're going to allow people to buy whatever device they want, if you publish a list that says all iOS devices get full access to the ecosystem, you can get the apps, you can do your expenses, do everything else. You buy Android 4.3 Samsung device, or this list of devices, you get full access to the ecosystem. You buy this subset of devices, we're going to give you email. That's it, and we're going to make you use this client. You buy this set of devices, you're going to get nothing. Guess what happens to your users? First of all, they're thrilled to see the list because it's guidance to them. But the other piece of it is, magically they go out and they tend to buy things that are at the top tier if that's what they want to do, if it's BYOD, especially if it's forced BYOD. And that's what they tend to come in with. They come in with stuff that works. Now, it's a little bit different if we look at someone like Scott over here and Dave, who work for VMware, mandates BYOD, but also make a product that they may be told you have to get this phone or that phone because this is the product. I have no idea. I know there are companies that do that, but they're a vendor, so I'll be I'll pick on them only a little bit. But when you do manage BYOD, it really does magically work out that way. If you're giving them a choice, not really, but they think it's a choice, and they look at that choice. Dave did a great presentation last year on FUIT and what some of the users do. When users think they're empowered to get whatever they want, and they know the consequences of what they got, they'll actually get the right thing most of the time. Not all the time, but most of the time they will get the right thing. And we have controls in place that if they get the wrong thing, it's actually kind of easy for us to limit them. Because the first thing they do is they go to email, and when they go to email, we know exactly what device they have, and we can block it or whatever else. And then they're kind of toast. So,
I do want to go back, though, to one of the points that we had a couple of bullets ago. It's even in the way I presented it, seemed to indicate that mobile is like better, but that HTML5 is like an effective fallback. But I want to emphasize that there are many scenarios in which, in my opinion, HTML5 has a definite advantage. First of all, Brian listed a couple of features that are problematic, maybe, but in fact, a lot of these features actually do exist and exist in all browsers. I mean, if I want the orientation thing, it exists now in all modern browsers.
And I'll agree with you.
GPS, I have to click accept the first time I use the web app, but after that, that's okay. So that's number one. Another point which I also made in my HTML5 presentation, and you need to consider this, is that this is the only technology, at least in my opinion, that's future-proof. I mean, right, we have a more effective mechanism of distributing applications, but a lot of enterprise applications, especially internal enterprise applications, are written potentially for decades. I mean, to an extent, this conference exists because we need to continue to work with and support and provide applications that were written 20 years ago. Well, if you create a native mobile application, you need to take into account that there's a good chance that in, 5, 10 years, this platform will not exist.
Yeah, but Dan, let's go back to your presentation, the last one, and say, that's all fine and dandy, but Google just went to Blink. They have forked WebKit.
Yeah, but
but
everything that works, it's the same standard. I don't care about the engine.
They support the standard today. The question becomes, what happens a year from now when WebKit and Blink are no longer at the same spot?
Look, I can't guarantee, and I can't
guarantee it. I'm just saying.
That's what they're looking to evolve.
All
a rendering engine without the baggage that comes with supporting iOS and everything else that's in the WebKit framework.
I hope that's the case.
I would hope so too, but I think they would be shooting themselves in the foot to be like, screw HTML5.
No browser can do it that these days.
I think that's pretty.
HTML5, baby.
Yeah.
So I want to read you a couple of quotes here, and I particularly want to hear Dan comment on this.
Oh, okay, for sure.
So I was chairing panels at MobileBeat 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
And universally, the CTOs of Evernote, Pandora, LinkedIn, etc., they were all making comments to the effect that HTML5 is okay, but if you spend any time in an app, you got to write a native app. And these are companies that where they're going to have to write native apps for each, so they have to invest in them. So there's definitely a different investment level here. But it was kind of universal that if anybody spends any time in your app, you don't want HTML5, you want native ones. And I'd like to hear you.
Okay, so the answer.
It wasn't like there was any debate.
So the answer to that is when you say any amount of time, how much time do you actually mean? Because if you're looking at an app like a Facebook app, people on mobile devices literally live inside their Facebook app. Their Facebook app is open from more or less the moment they turn on the phone until they turn off the phone. Same with Twitter, same with LinkedIn. So if you have a highly interactive application, one like Facebook or LinkedIn that constantly updates its user interface, and is running all the time, and also needs potentially push notifications out to the phone, I totally agree with them. It needs to be a native application. If, on the other hand, you're talking about an application that's more like an in and out application, or an application that may be open a long period of time, but is not super interactive in the sense that it's not constantly updating the display and has something like an infinite list of or images that are constantly being pushed to you from a server, then I don't think this is such of an issue. One of the biggest problems that we've seen with HTML5 so far, and again, I believe it will be solved, it's just in the process, is memory consumption. The problem with these applications is not that they couldn't do the animations. Some of the things might not be fast enough within HTML5, but generally they were. So for LinkedIn, they were able to do something like 85% of their UI using in their native app. They did it hybrid using HTML5. But the problem was, and they said it, that they basically ran out of memory after something like an hour or two. Now again, if you're writing this type of an application, I totally agree with that.
But I think, I go in and out of I use all those apps, and I use Evernote too. I go in and out of them. I don't live them.
So I was going to end on this because I figured it was the best way to end the debate. But I'll say it now. I think the debate's over. And the reason I think the debate's over, and for those of you that read the web and everything else, 80% of all apps are native. Some of those have some hybrid pieces, but in reality, 80% of all apps are native. We've been hearing HTML5, but really web apps for 4 years now. I mean, Steve Jobs started with it. And again, I think there are places where it does make sense to do a web app, but 80% of the apps that you get out there are native. Now, where it becomes interesting,
I guess what I'm saying is, we're living in this world, in this discussion of saying these are the only things that exist.
Well,
Desktops clearly exist.
Sure.
LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook and every one of those guys has an HTML5 app that runs on Mac and that runs on your desktop. Yep. So they're doing native and.
Yeah, and that's another key because
you can't say that they're not doing that.
Sure.
You kind of interrupted me, so I need to interrupt you back. The other.
There we go.
Yeah.
Come on, Sheldon.
Bazinga. No, the other thing that I wanted to say was that if you look at all of these guys, they all said we needed native apps, but they all have websites. I mean, Facebook has a website, LinkedIn has a website. Now, basically what they were saying really is that for them, hybrid apps failed. They're not saying that the web apps failed. People who use web on their mobile devices continue to use web on their mobile devices. They created their native apps using hybrid technology, and that ultimately failed for them.
Yeah, but web apps fail too. Look, I pulled up this slide. We did this in Google Drive. We worked together, we worked on it, Google Drive. I brought it up in Google Docs. I wanted to double check the slides a while back. You know what? Because I hadn't loaded the slides, because I was on vacation last week, in a week, doing the slide transitions the first time until the data was cached, everything else, sucked. If I tried to do that right before we got in here, and I didn't have his laptop, I'd be screwed. To me, that's huge, because when I walk into, if I'm one of my salespeople and I have to show a presentation to somebody, and it's a web app, and that stuff's not cached, then again, let's not say that I agree. There are websites, you build for what it makes sense. But if you've ever tried using the Facebook website on your tablet or your phone, it's usable, but you really don't want to spend your time in there. It's not the responsive piece that it is. Now, where I think that we do need that responsive piece is I think that what Facebook should have done, or should do, is you should have responsive web design, which should be part of it, which says you're on a mobile device, we're going to scale it down. And we're going to do these pieces that make sense because we detected you're on a mobile device. They don't do that.
Remember Facebook Basic? Right? For a while, Facebook had actually a basic interface that did exactly that.
But you had to call it up. You actually had to click over to Facebook Basic to go to it.
Look, people do bad. Sorry.
Contact information and require you to give them all discover all your accounts. I don't run the app. Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook. I don't run any of them because
Yeah, I mean, people do
So
bed
do I.
web do bed web apps, but they also do bed native apps. I mean, I've had native apps crash. I have native apps crash and freeze my phone. I've never had a web app freeze
I
my
have,
phone.
but that's
So where you guys are taking me right now is I feel like HTML5 is right for my desktop, where my human interface device is, MKS, mouse, keyboard, and screen. HTML5 serves me just fine on the desktop with the exception of PowerPoint, which I still feel way more comfortable in the native app. On my phone or on any mobile device, I want native, not hybrid. The only place where I will put a little asterisk next to that is I'm damn sick and tired of, do you wish to install the mobile app?
That's what I was gonna say. Do you do that on every website? 'Cause I don't
So here's first of all, I agree with you.
responsive design of
That sucks. Number one, 100% sucks. I think that I think there's a place for responsive design on websites. I think there's a place for forums and everything else. I know that we've had the conversation where we said, hey, you built a website, for our brand. We expect it to run on these mobile devices. We're not really going to put an app out for Allegra. We're not going to put an app out for Ambien.
Right.
That's not something that we're going to do. It doesn't make sense. I can tell you that what we used to do is we used to commission a website for one, and then we'd go back and we'd ask for one for iOS or something else. They charge us the exact same price again. So what we spent $200,000 for the first time, or whatever that price was, we had to spend another $200,000. It may have been 70, maybe whatever it was. And so that becomes an issue. But and we really didn't get to this, but if we're going to talk about hybrid for a second, hybrid on the presentation layer can make some sense, because if you're using responsive web design, you can reuse that presentation layer on different devices because the native detects the screen and can tell the presentation layer what to do.
Good example, just help me out.
Good. I'm going to give that one over to Dan.
Best example of a hybrid app.
Hybrid app?
Yeah,
I'm
well-
actually not a fan of hybrid apps, to be honest.
Does anybody know a good hybrid app?
No, a good. Let's put it this way: a
good
good
hybrid app, you don't know
app,
that
you
it's
wouldn't
hybrid
exactly,
usually.
exactly. A good hybrid app, you wouldn't even know that it's hybrid, and that exactly goes to the root of the problem, because HTML5 can be a very good vehicle for creating user interfaces on mobile devices. The problem, by the way, the problem here is more of developer knowledge than it is of the availability of the tools. The tools are still evolving for sure, but right now it's more of an education sort of a problem. Most of the web developers come from a desktop world, so that's the world they know to develop for. So it's not that the browser can't do touch effectively, it's that they don't know how to do touch in the browser. But the thing is that the big problem for me with hybrid apps is that when I use an app as an app, I don't want to know how the developer created it, which platform he used, which tools. And
That's my question. I don't care about the technology.
and with hybrid, I'm trying to use HTML5 to build a user interface that looks like an iOS user interface. And that's hard to do. In some cases, it's so hard to do that it's just easier to say screw it and just do the multiple user interfaces. And it's not just with hybrid apps. There are other cross-platform libraries out there, Marmalade and stuff. And in many cases, from my perspective, it's not worth the pain, because you have such a huge developer audience working with the native interfaces and native APIs, and then you have this API that created by some third party, and you don't know who they are, and they don't support this widget or that widget. If you want to get a perfect UI that matches the platform you're running on, go native. But that does mean that, again, if that's your requirement, if your requirement is, I want an iOS interface on iOS, I want an Android interface on Android, I want a Windows Phone interface on Windows Phone, then you need to take into account that you're going to be developing this app 3 times.
Right, so it's the same amount of work.
Yeah. To answer your question, and I could be wrong at this point, feel free somebody to call bullshit. If I remember correctly, the Pulse app, the Pulse News app when it originally came out, was actually a hybrid app. I don't know whether it still is. But it was a great app. Worked quite well. Still does. I know a lot of people who use it. We developed one similar to that.
I'm not familiar with that. So what did it look like? Did it look like a web page?
Well, you could move between. Essentially, you went between stories and all that sort of stuff, and it was essentially a news reader. So, but it was pretty much presenting you the news in a nice formatted way, easy to use, tablet, phone. Did I care what it was? No.
By the way, I do have to say, though, that LinkedIn did not, when they switched, they didn't switch because they thought they couldn't create an effective user interface to work initially using HTML5, because they weren't trying to, they intentionally did not create an app that looked like the standard native app. You had their own look and feel. Their problem was that after 2 hours, the app would run out of memory. That's the thing that caused them to or become so sluggish that it
that's
wasn't
a big
usable.
if. So, that's a big issue. So we're going to skip round 3 because I think we're just about out of time. Is that correct? I'm going to just offer my thoughts up to Scott. Scott asked me what I thought of PhoneGap and the like. So there's PhoneGap, there's Xamarin, there are a couple others that I can't think of off the top of my head. Until recently, I would have told you skip them. I think unless you're developing a very basic, easy-to-use app, I didn't find that they gave you very good results. You still spent a lot of time doing stuff. It didn't necessarily look as good across all the things. I think they're getting better. I don't think they're completely there yet, but it depends upon what you're trying to do. And their premise is code in what you know, .NET, Java, whatever it happens to be, and we're going to convert it to a native app. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. And so it's a crapshoot, and you kind of got to figure it out.
Titanium still doing
I think I saw it somewhere. I think it still exists.
So
the problem is with these things, by the way, is that they never die, because there's always some diehard that's going to continue to support it as an open source project. But in reality,
So I think we're out of time. Thank you, everybody. I hope that you had fun. Don't forget to fill out your forms. We like 5s, but we'll take what you give us. And thank you.